tell you behind the science man come, cause him can't squeeze the lion palm. No demonic words performed shall prosper. So all the evil that did me harm can go back where they came from. No demonic words performed shall prosper. Yeah. I tell you, behind the science man come, cause him can't squeeze the lion palm. Can't touch a lion, he's so humble. Can't touch a lion.
Yes, my skin is black, but that's no reason to hold me back.
I don't you give me no, 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 give me no. I have lots of desires, just like you. So you won't stop because I'm coming through. Oh. No matter how hard you try, you can't stop me now. No, 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 no. No matter how hard you try, you can't stop me now.
Yes, your skin is white. Does that make you right?
Why don't you give me no, 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 give me no. This is a message to you. Together we stand, divided we fall. Dark is a color, just like white. I've got a color like white, with all the right. We all have a fun, yes we do. So look in the mirror, look in the mirror. What do you see? What do you see? You are white and know, and I'm just like me. My eyes are open, but I refuse to see. The laws of society is made for both you and me. Because of my color, I struggle to be free. Sticks and stones can break my bone. So let me in, I'm gonna see my friend. No matter how hard you try, you can't stop me now. No, 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 no.
Parties, and sometimes slaves were given leftovers and broken china. The day after would usually be a lighter workload, and those slaves initiated a tradition around their day of rest. So during the 18th century, tea ceremonies were created during the final decades before emancipation.
The women would take the teacup, give it to the man of the house. The man of the house would walk around where all the slaves would live and offer a teacup to them to kind of signal and let them know that his house or his household, his home, was going to be offering a tea ceremony event.
In the 1930s and 40s, affluent Blacks became entrepreneurs by opening tea houses and offering safe places for community members to host events. Tea house owners offered exclusive services and tended to those in higher social classes than the average restaurant owner. They hosted groups like the NAACP Women's Auxiliary, Black sports writers, politicians, and civil rights leaders. But tea, especially loose leaf tea for some households, has always held a special meaning. And modern day entrepreneurs are bringing their love of tea to a new generation, like Jamila Wright, co-owner of Brooklyn Tea.
People want to be in a space where they can commune, right? They want to be in a space where their health is being put first, especially now, right? And tea creates that. It allows that space and that time to say, hey, I care about you. Let's talk about things that are most pressing, and let's do it over some really cool tea.
For some Black families, drinking tea has been long incorporated into family legacy and traditions.
My introduction was primarily through my partner in business and love, Ali Wright, and his relationship to tea growing up. His household, coming from a Caribbean culture, his mom is Jamaican. Tea is very much so a part of daily custom.
I had a beloved dad who was from the Caribbean. His side of the family was from St. Croix, Virgin Islands. And as a child, he grew up under some of the traditional English traditions, one being drinking tea.
Jamila's husband Ali became a tea sommelier, and the pair opened their shop in 2019.
Our purpose behind our company is to bring the most affordable and the most beautiful and quality of loose leaf to our customers. The first thing you get to do when you hit the door at Brooklyn Tea is smell the tea. We have a smelling wall, and we want you to get your nose in there and really smell and see for yourself that the cucumber melon actually has dry cucumber, right? To see that the black rose actually has dry roses in it.
Leslie Alex opened Lola's Tea Shop, which was named after her mother and in honor of her father in 2007.
We had every kind of activity and function, and we had knitting bees and book clubs and book signings and open mic nights and poetry and tea parties with animated, life-size characters for the kids, and any kind of themed type of event we were available for.
Leslie survived the 2008 recession, but eventually had to close her brick and mortar location. In 2012, she converted her shop into a mobile tea catering business.
The mobile tea party catering business, which is now called The Tea Experience, has kind of morphed. I thought it would really only be focused on party catering, but now it's kind of morphed into much more than what I've actually expected.
And both found different ways to promote their businesses and increase sales during the pandemic.
The pandemic definitely did and continues to test us. At the start, we just turned a year old, and there came a turning point where we thought about, okay, it's always been important to us to center what our customers need and what they value most. And at that time, they were valuing how to best have control over their immune systems, right? What could they do that felt tangible enough and accessible enough? And tea is a great solution for that. And so we curated this immunity box, and that helps.
I started hosting virtual events, but then I was also asked to host virtual events as well. And then with that came the request for, well, can you send us some tea while we're doing the tea tastings? And can you send us, and it became, a product line for me called Simplicity.
But it's the tea that's at the heart of these businesses. Not only is it sourced from all over the world, but benefits of loose leaf tea can be used to help a number of ailments.
We source from India, China, Kenya, South Africa, Taiwan, all these different countries. One, we do direct sourcing from farmers. There's soursop that we get straight from a local farmer in Grenada.
The heart benefits and the antioxidant benefits and the anti-cancer benefits. And now we're finding it helps certain teas help people to reduce their stress and anxiety. Some that have digestive issues, there's certain teas for them. And so I think my customers are now going beyond what just tastes good.
The history of tea houses has not only influenced Black tradition, but it's also allowed Blacks to explore entrepreneurship for centuries.
Tea has been around for thousands of years, and a closer look at it, you can see that tea was always trying to evolve and trying to be in a way that was accessible to others. Thinking about gunpowder green tea, which is one of the oldest tracked teas, they tightly rolled the tea so that it could travel, right? And that it could be more accessible and more durable and that it could be something that made sense for modern people, right? And so we just took that same level of care and intention into today.
Tea houses have become kind of the central place where a lot of people get their information and knowledge and the ability to discern which tea types they actually like and which ones taste good and which ones don't based on their palate. And so you get all that opportunity offered through tea houses.
To watch classic Black films, documentaries, and much more, tune in today.
Downtown were shaken with fear as the security forces made their way into sections of Tivoli Gardens and Denham Town today. Kalila Enriquez spoke to some of those residents earlier.
These were the armed forces on the waterfront in downtown Kingston at about 1 p.m. in position and full gear as helicopters buzzed ahead and the Coast Guard patrolled the waters. The sound of gunfire was dangerously close. The media was not allowed to go any closer. Reports were that the armed forces had launched an air attack. Several women saying they were Tivoli residents called our news center expressing fear.
Right now the soldiers them live up on the remand center top, then the pan Shetola Park school top, then the pan the house top them and we cannot come out, then the pan blood bank top, cut all the fire through the window them over here. We are going to cross the road and shop cap and last night we not eat. A peer shot we can't go cross the road and we are home and helicopter drive up in the sky and that boom and pick me there. I'm in the house under my bed and I hear bomb drop. I can hear the gunshot. They directly surrounding each the building, each house is in Tivoli and directly shooting at them. And they're saying, put on more. That's what the police are saying. So can't make any move because we have backup bomb. They are dropping bombs from the helicopter down in the place. What must we do? This is how they deal with people, and they say they're going to deal with it in an orderly manner. And they are dropping bomb in the place because of one man. This is not right. The helicopter is throwing grenade on the house. And the house is in Tivoli Gardens.
So on the houses that they're throwing these bombs, are there people in these houses?
Yes, people and kids. Children is in the house.
From Arnett Gardens, we could see thick black smoke emerging from Coronation Market. It is not yet clear how it came ablaze. Residents report hearing heavy explosions from as early as 10 a.m. On Spanish Town Road, this woman was shot just a few feet away from our news team as we prepared for a live broadcast. A woman was just shot right next to where I'm standing. This is the scene here on Spanish Town Road and between Maxfield Avenue and Waltham Park. The shot came literally out of nowhere just moments ago. There were scores of people littering the streets here. There you go again, another barrage of heavy gunfire. The area coming under attack. Dozens of people had been on the road gazing at the smoke. The sudden sound of gunshots made them scatter. Meanwhile, criminals in other areas appear to have taken advantage of the terror in Tivoli to wage their own attack. On Whitfield Avenue, 2 men were shot dead, this house torched, bodies burned inside. A little girl was traumatized. Gunmen had kicked in her door, gun-butted her mother, and shot her stepfather in the head as she watched. She begged our news team to take her somewhere safe and asked whether she would be able to go to school tomorrow. The terror of the past several hours has left everyone shaken, especially the children. Kalila Enriquez, CVM News.
Hey baby, do you expect the world from me? Oh baby, just because you know I care so much about you, you think it gives a right to do just about whatever you want to. All I'd surround, wishing, praying, hoping, dreaming, or hurt myself by just being lazy. But I won't sit around crying over you, know. There's another life I better live, and that's what I'm gonna do, yes. I'm gonna be myself for once, I'm gonna be brand new. And as long as you live, girl, type man your mama visualized for you. Still, I'm trying to do the best I can every time I can for you. But I won't be sitting around crying over you. No, no. Got a lot of life to live, and that's what I'm gonna do. Yeah. I'm gonna be myself. I'm gonna be brand new. And as long as you live, girl, you won't see me surrender. No, no, I won't surrender. No, 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 no. Hey, baby, now do you expect the world from me? I'm just a simple man. Yeah. I cannot tell myself that I'm not hurting deep down inside of me, but I can't afford to let it lead me to insanity. Yeah. For every single man, there's a woman in store. A lot would pray for what you got, but still you're asking for more. But I won't sit around crying over you. No, no. I got a lot of life to live. That's what I'm gonna do. I'll be myself. I'm gonna be brand new. As long as you leave, girl, you won't see me surrender. I won't surrender. Just because you know I care so much about you.
Once again, good morning to all. Today is what? Today is Monday. What is the day today? This one? No. This one? No. This letter? Yes. Very good. Which letter is this? Letter B. Huh? Letter B. So let's manage with this one. No. This one? No. This one? Yes. Very good. So I'll give you a book after you do this same, okay? Yeah.
Welcome to the Black Father Support Group show here on the Galaxy for We.net. Once again, we are here as the Black Father Support Group show. Things that are happening around the world, things that could be happening to us. I'm telling you, wait a minute. Let me put on my ears. Let me put on my ears so that we can hear you properly here. All right. Oop. Just a little bit too much. This. All right. Yes, we're here live in the studio. Lines open 0203-289-6504. Let me say that slower. 0203-289-6504. Things that are missing. I was just this afternoon, I was walking my local area. And as per chance, I bumped into a brother. Yeah, and we were just talking about certain things that we can put into place, you know. And it just one of those subjects that just came out, and it came out of our conversation, and stating that, you know, generations of people that have passed and that are passing, in line with the ancestral day as well, because, you know, said that we always give reverence to our ancestors. A brother that had just passed, an elder that has passed in the community, in the Brixton community. And when the brother inquired to the other people who came there to pay homage to this elder, he asked them, like, how, what did they know about him? And all they could say was that, he was a good man, and that, he always spoke to them with respect and words of encouragement, and that was the influence what they had. And then he got into an emotional side of it, because obviously, he was feeling it very bad. He feels it very well, and the fact that this elder had passed, and the influence that this person had had on his life personally, was far beyond just a passing, making acquaintance. And as he put it, that he was, in a state of that he didn't know what he was going to be doing with his own life, but he had that, tenacity to actually do things, get things done. Always there to get things done, right? And through I mean, I would say that the majority of our community knows of this young brother. Because we all know of this young brother and the works that he has done and the works that he's actually doing right now. But the influence, and he said that a lot of people don't realize that this man was like my real father. He was like my father on the road, you know? And the respect that he was showing to this person it's like, it literally was like somebody of his own family, direct family, that had passed. And the thing, we do not realize how influential we can be. We do not realize how influential we can be, right? Just to take that moment to guide some young person. It just could literally be a 10-minute speak, 10 minutes talk. And I say this because, I went out for a walk the previous day. Right, I went out for a walk for a previous day, um, from my caring duties, so a break from my caring duties. And as I'm walking there, I was stopped by two people, and they inquired after the welfare of my mother. And I explained to them that, look, her condition is getting worse, progressively worse. But apart from that, she's healthy in her body, and in her strength as well. And we can do the best that we can. And each one of them had a recount of how she was such a influential person in her own right, and how they really looked up to her, you know, because she was such a strong person. Right? So imagine this strong woman with her only son and doing things by herself. Yeah, and I think to myself, well, you know what? Thank you for the recognition, really. But the thing is that when do we pass this mantle on? How do we pass this mantle on? Because there are many, many, many of us, right, who would like to achieve, and yet when we achieve, we want to step up. We need to step up. We need to progress. We can't be just relying on the foundations of what has been done before. Huh? I was watching the video. I'm going to see if I can. I'm going to see if I'm going to bring it up, and I'm going to highlight it as well. I was watching a video this afternoon, a video documentary, and it was about the housing market, after the war, right after the World War. So 1944, 1940, 44. Okay. Now we had these wars, and obviously this is based on the American aspect, right? And people had gone into the war. I remember not too long prior to that, they had a civil war, and yet when these soldiers went to war for their country that they lived in, they still were segregated. I remember the Civil War, what they had, right? That was a war to say, right, let's end all of this segregation business, right? Free, they threw in the free. You can be free if you fight for the country and all this business there, right? Which a lot of the soldiers went and fought in the war for the Civil War, and yet still they have a segregations, and they put that into law as well for purchasing property. So in other words, there would be no generational wealth passed on. There'd be no privileges of of the monetary savings or anything like that, because still the banks would not be accepting certain or giving loans for certain types of businesses or residency, right? Because remember, before they passed a bill to purchase a house, that prior to that you had to have something between 40 to 50% of the actual cost of the house, and proof that you could pay the rest of it back as well, right? So you had to have 40 to 50% of the value of the house as deposit, right? And then they brought it down to was it 15 to 20%? I think it was 15 to 20% that was mentioned on there. I think it's more 10%. Anyhow, 10%. And the mortgage would be cheaper. But the thing is that in a lot of cases, that the houses that were available, right, in actual form of cost, it was cheaper to buy a house than what it would be to an apartment in the city area of like New York, for instance. So for someone to buy a house in the suburbs, it would be cheaper, and then obviously the advantage of the space and the type of home it would be furnished and everything else, and. But yet, when black people went to apply for these houses to buy houses, I'm sorry, but no, we can't sell it to you. We're not selling it to Negroes. Yeah, you see, so that's what happened. And there was one place there, as they were stating, there's one place there that some black people moved into the area, and then all of a sudden the mortgages were withdrawn, and the only way that they would get those mortgages back, the only way they would get those mortgages back was to segregate the area. So what they did, they built a 6-foot wall right across the whole area to divide the white side and the black side. Oh dear, oh dear. This is the type of foolishness that people have been facing all the time. In other words, the racism is a thing that will always be there. It has been there, and it is there, and even now, even till today, it is still there. And do we put up with it? I think we do. I think we do. Anyhow, here on the Black Father Support Group show, we're going to be looking at some things here, that what can we put in place to ensure that we have a form of legacy, right? So that's the form of our conversation this evening. Our legacy, how strong is it, and how do we establish it for ourselves? So give us a call on 0203 289 6504. Let me give you something else. Let me give it something different. Let me give it just something a little bit different. Let me see. Oh, Gappy. Anyway, let's give it try a bit of Gappy. Yeah, there we are. Oh, helps if I put the volume up in it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Love the rhythm, man. Yeah, man. Marty. Don't want nobody call me Batman again. Don't want nobody call me gangster. Don't want nobody call me no general. Them type of name me no answer. And right now I'm heading to the garrison, you know, and smuggling love like a smuggler. Me not carry guns, me not carry badness. Just your bread and water. To every son and daughter I say I bring greetings. Don't you know I bring love? Don't you know that I have a message and it's coming from way up above? And when me forward, me not carry bad feelings. Don't you know I bring love? Don't you know that I have a message and it's coming from way up above? Get up people, judge a careful. He never left your side, he is there for you. There's no rush, there's no rush. The most I will prepare for you. And he will be your witness when family and friends can't swear for you. Oh, give Jaja all that you respect and hold him up in every aspect. Me never come to collect, I say I bring greetings. Don't you know I bring love? Don't you know that I have a message and it's coming from way up above? And when me forward, me not carry bad feelings. Don't you know I bring love? Don't you know that I have a message and it's coming from way up above? Don't want nobody call me Batman again. Don't want nobody call me gangster. Don't want nobody call me no general. Them type of name me no answer. And right now I'm heading to the garrison, you know, and smuggling love like a smuggler. Me not carry guns, me not carry bandits, just your bread and water. To every son and daughter I say I bring greetings. Don't you know I bring love? Don't you know that I have a message and it's coming from way up above? And when me forward, me not carry bad feelings. Don't you know I bring love? Don't you know that I have a message and it's coming from way up above? Marty. Get up people, Jaja careful. He never left your side, he is here for you. There's no rush, there's no rush. The most I will prepare for you. And he will be your witness when family and friends can't swear for you. Oh, give Jaja all that you respect and hold him up high in every aspect. Me never come to collect, I say I bring greetings. Don't you know I bring love? Don't you know that I have a message and it's coming from way up above? And when me forward, me not carry bad feelings. Don't you know I bring love? Don't you know that I have a message and it's coming from way up above? Yeah, man. I bring greetings. Don't you know I bring love? Don't you know that I have a message and it's coming from way up above? And when me forward, me not carry bad feelings. Don't you know?
Yes, I found it. So I'm gonna play a piece of this clip here, yeah. Piece of this audio. Okay. All right, let me see how you go. Let me see how this goes now.
They received the highest rating, and that was the color green. Those communities that were all minority or in the process of changing, they got the lowest rating and the color red. They were redlined. As a consequence, most of the mortgages went to suburbanizing America, and it suburbanized it racially.
The racial logic adopts the principle that An integrated neighborhood is a bad risk, is a financial risk, that an integrated neighborhood is likely to be an unstable neighborhood, unstable socially, but therefore also unstable economically.
When the white residents of 8 Mile Road in Detroit were told they were too close to a black neighborhood to qualify for a positive FHA rating, they built this 6-foot wall between themselves and their black neighbors. Once the wall went up, mortgages on the white properties were approved. Between 1934 and 1962, the federal government underwrote $120 billion in new housing. Less than 2% went to non-whites.
I can understand an individual, depending on his environment or his family or whatever, being racist, but for your country to sanction it, give him tools to do that, there's something definitely wrong there.
I think we had the golden chance after World War II, and we flubbed it, because here we had a GI Bill that was that was available to everybody, but in a way they didn't make it available to everybody, and that was a golden opportunity in this country, and we missed it. We really missed it.
You can always tell, can't you? A town with good real estate people is a more substantial community because more people own their own homes. That's right.
And now it's sort of hard to believe that the federal government nationalized and introduced redlining. In a funny way, it wasn't just giving something to whites, it was constructing whiteness. Whiteness meant, as in the past, whites had meant being a citizen and being a Christian. It now meant living in the suburbs.
Only 50 years before, European ethnics were believed to be distinct races. Now, in these new segregated neighborhoods, they blended together as white Americans.
We did have different religious groups. We were mixed up there, but we were an all-white community, and I think it's an unrealistic world. I think there's something sterile about everyone being on the same economic level and everyone being the same color.
It certainly doesn't promote a feeling of a wider world, wider, not whiter, to live in a place where there are only people that look like you.
Cartoonist Bill Griffith remembers moving from Brooklyn to Levittown as a kid.
It's an untenable artificial world. You're creating a weird utopia in a way, a utopia of middle-class white people who were trying to deny that they were living in a multi-racial world. And how long can you keep that up? You can't keep that up forever. Whether there were going to be black people in Levittown was just, it would be almost the equivalent of saying, are there going to be Martians in Levittown?
Basically, the idea of whiteness is who's included, who's part of the family, and it has material consequences. Blacks weren't completely left out of the housing market. The housing market that they were exposed to was largely public housing. And public housing, first of all, was built almost exclusively, with a few exceptions, in the central city. And after World War II, we started building these larger and larger public housing projects, which were called vertical ghettos. All of a sudden, you're concentrating large numbers of poor people of color in one place.
Another federal program, urban renewal, was supposed to make cities more livable. 90% of all housing destroyed by urban renewal was not replaced. 2/3 of those displaced were Black or Latino.
Fair housing for all human beings who live in this country is now a part of the American way of life.
In 1968, President Johnson signed the Fair Housing Act. For the first time, racial language was removed from federal housing policy. Non-white families began moving into traditionally white communities in numbers.
We lived in an apartment, a two-family house in Queens, and when we came here, it was the first time we had bought a house, and I was looking for everything in the storybooks.
The Frisbees moved from Queens to suburban Roosevelt, only a few miles from Levittown. Like the Frisbees, many non-white families would discover the economic value of race in the real estate market. They watched as their homes and neighborhoods in suburbia declined precisely because they had moved into them.
When I moved into a neighborhood, I thought it would stay intact the way it was. On the street that I moved on when I moved there, it was predominantly white. Within 2 years, it was predominantly Black.
It was called blockbusting.
You should see the look on her face.
Real estate agents preyed on the racial fears of white homeowners to get them to sell their homes quickly for less than market value. The homes were resold to non-whites at inflated prices.
Well, they would say, you know, we're having Black people move in. Now, I will give you cash if you want to sell me your house. Do you want to stay with Black people next door to you? And that's the way it went on. And as Bunny said, a lot of the people just said, yes, I'll take the money and run. And that's the start of the white people leaving.
As more Black and Latino families moved to Roosevelt, real estate became more and more depressed, just as the FHA had predicted. But why?
I have an idea my house is probably worth around 120 in this town. But what it would be worth in Wantor or Garden City or some other place, probably around 200,000 or better. Now you're talking about 80,000. You said to me one time about why do people dislike the Blacks? Well, money-wise, there's a reason. Not that you dislike the Blacks so much, but you dislike what happens when a community turns from white to Black.
It wasn't African Americans moving in that caused housing values to go down in Roosevelt and other neighborhoods. It was whites leaving.
When a neighborhood, a previously white neighborhood, starts to integrate, even if individual whites don't have personal or psychological animosity or racial hatred, they still have an economic incentive to leave because they recognize that others might make the same calculation and leave first. So you get a vicious circle where whites calculate that other whites are going to sell when a neighborhood integrates. Therefore, they want to sell first to avoid losses, and they actually make it happen. They make white flight happen.
And if you think about African Americans, if African Americans are 20% of that market, it means that 80% of the people are not looking in those places for homes. So the prices of those homes declines or stays stable. And banks contribute to this by continually making loans in regions that are on the rise, white communities, and making it difficult to get loans in Black communities.
So there's a difference. There's a lack of symmetry that's important to keep in mind. So it's not the same when whites are all by themselves, because when they're all by themselves, they're taking all the resources with them. They're taking all the amenities with them. But when blacks are by themselves, they can't get loans. They don't have a decent tax base. There are no jobs, and then that becomes associated with black space.
In the end, what happened to Roosevelt happens in many neighborhoods when white families and businesses flee. The tax base eroded. Schools and services declined. The town was seen by county officials as a legitimate dumping ground for welfare families.
At one point, we had explicit laws that says whites are on top and blacks are on the bottom. Today, we have many of the same practices without the explicit language. And those practices are largely inscribed in geography. And so geography does the work of Jim Crow laws. So many people are confused as why after 50 years of civil rights are our schools still segregated? Why are our housing markets still segregated? Why are our jobs still segregated? And again, a lot of this is a function of how we've reinscribed the racial geographic space of the United States. That structure is still what we're living with today.
As homes in white communities appreciated in value, the net worth of these white families grew. For most non-white families who stayed in urban neighborhoods, the housing market open to them in the 50s and 60s was largely a rental market. You don't gain equity by paying rent.
Where one's family lives in America is not just a matter of taste and preference. You have the issue of housing and wealth. The majority of Americans hold most of their wealth in the form of home equity. So that's their nest egg. That's how they can finance the education of their offspring. That's how they can sort of save up for retirement.
Listen to this part.
It's their savings bank, right? They're living in their savings bank.
Living in their savings.
My family, like a lot of families, was in Detroit struggling to buy a house. You had a dual housing market, one white, one black. A housing market with a lot of demand, another housing market with very little demand. My father lives in the house that I grew up in. The house today, 5-bedroom house, is worth about $20,000. That same house bought in the suburbs would be worth today about $320,000. So whites moving to the suburb were being subsidized in the accumulation of wealth, while blacks were being divested.
And these were public policy decisions in which, on one hand, people were given access to property.
Hold on. Did you get that? Did you get that? The same type of house, one in the black area and one in the white area. The one in the black area is worth $20,000. The same house in the white area is $320,000. Do you hear what's going on? Do you hear? Okay.
Given title and subsequently wealth. And on another hand, where people were not given access to property, did not generate wealth, and did not generate the kind of opportunity for the next generation.
So if you can get a government loan and with your GI Bill, your newly earned college degree, and buy a house in an all-white area that then appreciates in value, that then you can pass on to your children, then you're passing on wealth that has all been made more available to you as a consequence of racist policies and practices. To the child of that parent, it looks like my father worked hard, bought a house, passed his wealth on to me, made it possible for me to go to school, mortgage that house so I could have, relatively debt-free college experience and finance my college education. How come your father didn't do that? Well, there's some good reasons why maybe your father had a harder time doing it if you're African American or Latino or Native American.
And the thing that's really slick about whiteness, if you will, is that most of the benefits can be obtained without ever doing anything personally. For whites, they're getting the spoils of the racist system, even if they're not personally racist.
That
To
is
glimpse
where we
one of
come
the
in now.
far-reaching consequences of racial inequality, you need only consider one statistic: comparative net worth or wealth. If you add up everything you own and subtract all your debts, what's left is your net worth.
Today, the average black family has only 1/8 the net worth or assets of the average white family. That difference has seemingly grown since the 1960s, since the civil rights triumphs, and is not explained by other factors like education, earnings rates, savings rates. It is really the legacy of racial inequality from generations past. No other measure captures the legacy, the sort of cumulative disadvantage of race, or cumulative advantage of race for whites than net worth or wealth.
Even with the same income, white families have on average twice the wealth of black families. Much of that difference lies in the value of their homes. But what happens when we compare families along the color line who have similar wealth?
When you make the right comparison, when you compare a black kid from a family with the same income and wealth level as the white kid from the similar economic situation, rates of college graduation are the same. Rates of employment and work hours are the same. Rates of welfare usage are the same. So when we're talking about race in terms of a cultural accounting of these differences or a genetic accounting of these differences, we're really missing the picture because we're making the wrong comparison.
We want to be
On the one hand, the civil rights era officially ended inequality of opportunity, officially ended de jure legal inequality. At the same time, those civil rights triumphs did nothing to address the underlying economic and social inequalities that had already been in place. It doesn't recognize the fact that the rewards, the house, the Lexus, the big bank account, those are not only the rewards of the pot of gold at the end of the game, they're also the starting position for the next generation.
The wealth gap grows. The advantages of being white accumulate from one generation to the next.
What are the benefits or the advantages to being white in a society that has historically given benefits and advantages to members of the dominant group? And if you are a person who has that privilege, you don't necessarily notice it.
So until we recognize that there's really no way to talk about equality of opportunity without talking about equality of condition, then we're stuck with this paradoxical idea of a colorblind society in a society that's totally unequal by color.
Claiming we don't see race won't end racial inequality. As Supreme Court Justice Harry Blackmun said, to get beyond racism, we must first take account of race. There is no other way.
And just as we're born into this system, we don't ask to be loaded up with stereotypes or omissions or distortions when we come into the world. We don't ask to be in a structure which is unfair, but that's what we have inherited. Whether you identify as a person of color, whether you identify as a white person, it doesn't matter.
I think we have to be uncomfortable with the present racial arrangement. In a sense, I think we have to be willing to be uncomfortable, willing to demand more of ourselves and more of our country, and willing to make the invisible visible.
I think we all have to think about, what can I influence? I don't influence everything, but the things I do influence, I can think about how am I making this a more equitable environment. I can ask myself, who's included in this picture and who isn't? Who's had opportunities in my environment and who hasn't? What can I do about that?
Many a man has gone away. Many a man has gone astray, searching for the treasures of a love that's true. I'm hoping that my treasure can be you. And I believe the further you look, the less you see. I'm hoping you'd be the treasure for me. I've seen men carry their hopes from town to town, trying to track lost treasure down. Some find the true love before their hopes are gone. Others lose hope and they have to go on. And I believe the further you look, show love, the less you see. I'm hoping you be the treasure for me. Traveling on, wondering if they've done something wrong. Oh, wondering if I'm becoming a rover. But if you keep my searching is all over, Lord.
Welcome to the Black Father Support Group show here on the Galaxy of Farida.
Be the treasure. Traveling on, wondering if they've done something wrong. Wondering if I'm becoming a rover. But if you be my searching is all over, Lord. The further you look, show love, the less you see. I'm hoping you be the treasure for me, for me, for me. I'm hoping you be the treasure for me.
Who has been sitting, listening attentively, getting a wonderful reception here in the Cambridge Union. Tremendous enthusiasm from all sides of the House for Mr. Baldwin, who has been listening to the arguments. Now will bring the voice of actual experience to the debate.
Good evening. I find myself, not for the first time, in the position of a kind of Jeremiah. For example, I don't disagree with Mr. Burford that the inequality suffered by the American Negro population of the United States has hindered the American dream. Indeed, it has. I quarrel with some other things he has to say. The other deeper element of a certain awkwardness I feel has to do with it has to do with one's point of view. I have to put it that way. One's sense, one's system of reality. It would seem to me the proposition before the House, when I put it that way, is the American dream at the expense of the American Negro, or the American dream is at the expense of the American Negro, is a question hideously loaded, and that one's response to that question, or one's reaction to that question, has to depend on an effect on where you find yourself in the world, what your sense of reality is, what your system of reality is. That is, it depends on assumptions which we hold so deeply as to be scarcely aware of them. A white South African, or a Mississippi sharecropper, or a Mississippi sheriff, or a Frenchman driven out of Algeria, all have, at bottom, a system of reality which compels them to, for example, in the case of the French exile from Algeria, to defend French reasons for having ruled Algeria. The Mississippi or the Alabama sheriff, who really does believe when he's facing a Negro boy or girl, that this woman, this man, this child must be insane to attack the system to which he owes his entire identity. Of course, for such a person, the proposition of which we're trying to discuss here tonight does not exist. And on the other hand, I have to speak as one of the people who've been most attacked by what we must now here call the Western or the European system of reality. What white people in the world, the doctrine of white supremacy, I hate to say it here, comes from Europe. That's how it got to America. Beneath then, whatever one's reaction to this proposition is, has to be the question of whether or not civilizations can be considered as such equal, or whether one civilization has the right to overtake and subjugate and in fact to destroy another. Now what happens when that happens? Leaving aside all the physical facts which one can quote, leaving aside rape or murder, leaving aside the bloody catalog of oppression, which we are in one way too familiar with already, what this does to the subjugated, the most private, the most serious thing this does to the subjugated, is to destroy his sense of reality. It destroys, for example, his father's authority over him. His father can no longer tell him anything because the past has disappeared, and his father has no power in the world. This means, in the case of an American Negro, born in that glittering republic, and in the moment you are born, since you don't know any better, every stick and stone and every face is white, and since you have not yet seen a mirror, you suppose that you are too. It comes as a great shock around the age of 5 or 6 or 7 to discover that the flag to which you have pledged allegiance, along with everybody else, has not pledged allegiance to you. It comes as a great shock to discover that Gary Cooper killing off the Indians when you were rooting for Gary Cooper, that the Indians were you. It comes as a great shock to discover that the country, which is your birthplace and to which you owe your life and your identity, has not in its whole system of reality evolved any place for you. The disaffection, the demoralization, and the gap between one person and another, only on the basis of the color of their skins, begins there and accelerates throughout a whole lifetime, so that presently you realize you're 30 and are having a terrible time managing to trust your countrymen. By the time you are 30, you have been through a certain kind of mill. And the most serious effect of the mill you've been through is, again, not the catalog of disaster. The policemen, the taxi drivers, the waiters, the landlady, the landlord, the banks, the insurance companies, the millions of details, 24 hours of every day, which spell out to you that you are a worthless human being. It is not that. It's by that time you've begun to see it happening in your daughter or your son or your niece or your nephew. You are 30 by now, and nothing you have done has helped you to escape the trap. But what is worse than that is that nothing you have done, and as far as you can tell, nothing you can do, will save your son or your daughter from meeting the same disaster and not impossibly coming to the same end. Now, we're speaking about expense. I suppose there are several ways to address oneself to.
Here we go. Here we go.
Some attempt to define what that word means here. Let me put it this way, that from a very literal point of view, the harbors and the ports and the railroads of the country, the economy, especially of the southern states, could not conceivably be what it has become if they had not had, and do not still have indeed, and for so long, so many generations, cheap labor. I am stating very seriously, and this is not an overstatement, that I picked the cotton, and I carried it to market, and I built the railroads under someone else's whip for nothing. For nothing. The Southern oligarchy, which has until today so much power in Washington, and therefore some power in the world, was created by my labor and my sweat, and the violation of my women and the murder of my children. This, in the land of the free and the home of the brave. We're speaking about expense. I suppose there are several ways to address oneself to some attempt to define what that word means here. Let me put it this way, that from a very literal point of view, the harbors and the ports and the railroads of the country, the economy, especially of the southern states, could not conceivably be what it has become if they had not had, and do not still have indeed, and for so long, so many generations, cheap labor. I am stating very seriously, and this is not an overstatement, that I picked the cotton, and I carried it to market, and I built the railroads under someone else's whip for nothing. For nothing. The Southern oligarchy, which has until today so much power in Washington, and therefore some power in the world, was created by my labor and my sweat, and the violation of my women and the murder of my children. This, in the land of the free and the home of the brave. And no one can challenge that statement. It is a matter of historical record. In another way, this dream, and we'll get to the dream in a moment, is at the expense of the American Negro. You watch this in the Deep South in great relief, but not only in the Deep South. In the Deep South, you are dealing with a sheriff or a landlord or a landlady or the girl at the Western Union desk. And she doesn't know quite who she's dealing with, by which I mean that if you're not part of the town, and if you are a northern nigger, it shows in millions of ways. So she simply knows that it's an unknown quantity, and she wants to have nothing to do with it, So she won't talk to you. You have to wait for a while to get your telegram. Okay, we all know this. We've been through it. And by the time you get to be a man, it's very easy to deal with. But what is happening in the poor woman, the poor man's mind, is this. They've been raised to believe, and by now they helplessly believe, that no matter how terrible their lives may be, and their lives have been quite terrible, and no matter how far they fall, no matter what disaster overtakes them, they have one enormous knowledge and consolation, which is like a heavenly revelation. At least they are not black. Now I suggest that of all the terrible things that can happen to a human being, that is one of the worst. I suggest that what has happened to white Southerners is in some ways, after all, much worse than what has happened to Negroes there. Because Sheriff Clark in Selma, Alabama, cannot be considered, no one can be dismissed as a total monster. I'm sure he loves his wife, his children. I'm sure that, he likes to get drunk. He's, after all, one's got to assume, and he is visibly a man like me. But he doesn't know what drives him to use the club, to menace with the gun, and to use the cattle prod. Something awful must have happened to a human being to be able to put a cattle prod against a woman's breast, for example. What happens to the woman is gaslit. What happens to the man who does it is in some ways much, much worse. This is being done, after all, not 100 years ago, but in 1965, in a country which is blessed with what we call prosperity, a word we won't examine too closely, with a certain kind of social coherence, which calls itself a civilized nation and which espouses the notion of the freedom of the world. And it is perfectly true from the point of view now simply of an American Negro. Any American Negro watching this, no matter where he is, from the vantage point of Harlem, which is another terrible place, has to say to himself, in spite of what the government says we can't do anything about it. But those are white people being murdered in Mississippi work farms, being carried off to jail. Those are white children running up and down the streets. The government would find some way of doing something about it. We have a civil rights bill now. We had an amendment, the 15th Amendment, nearly 100 years ago. I hate to sound again like an Old Testament prophet, but if the amendment was not honored then, I don't have any reason for believing the civil rights bill will be honored now. And after all, one's been there since before, a lot of other people got there. If one has got to prove one's title to the land, isn't 400 years enough? 400 years, at least 3 wars. The American soil is full of the corpses of my ancestors. Why is my freedom or my citizenship or my right to live there, how is it conceivably a question now? And I suggest further that in the same way, the moral life of Alabama sheriffs and poor Alabama ladies, white ladies, their moral lives have been destroyed by the plague called color, that the American sense of reality has been corrupted by it. At the risk of sounding excessive, what I always felt when I finally left the country, found myself abroad in other places, and watched Americans abroad. And these are my countrymen. And I do care about them. And even if I didn't, there is something between us. We have the same shorthand. I know, when I look at a girl or a boy from Tennessee, where they came from in Tennessee, and what that means. No Englishman knows that, no Frenchman, no one in the world knows that except another black man who comes from the same place. One watches these lonely people denying the only kin they have. We talk about integration in America as though it was some great new conundrum. The problem in America is that we've been integrated for a very long time. Put me next to any African, and you will see what I mean. And my grandmother was not a rapist. What we are not facing is the results of what we've done. What one begs the American people to do for all our sakes is simply to accept our history. I was there not only as a slave, but also as a concubine. One knows the power, after all, which can be used against another person if you've got absolute power over that person. It seemed to me when I watched Americans in Europe that what they didn't know about Europeans was what they didn't know about me. They weren't trying, for example, to be nasty to the French girl or rude to the French waiter. They didn't know they hurt their feelings. They didn't have any sense that this particular woman, this particular man, though they spoke another language and had different manners and ways, was a human being. And they walked over them with the same kind of bland ignorance, condescension, charming and cheerful, with which they'd always patted me on the head and called me shy, and were upset when I was upset. What is relevant about this is that whereas 40 years ago when I was born, the question of having to deal with what is unspoken by the subjugated, what is never said to the master, of having to deal with this reality was a very remote possibility. It was in no one's mind. When I was growing up, I was taught in American history books that Africa had no history, and neither did I. That I was a savage, about whom the less said the better, who had been saved by Europe and brought to America. And of course, I believed it. I didn't have much choice. Those are the only books there were. Everyone else seemed to agree. If you walk out of Harlem, ride out of Harlem downtown, the world agrees. What you see is much bigger, cleaner, whiter, richer, safer than where you are. They collect the garbage. People obviously can pay their life insurance. The children look happy, safe. You're not. And you go back home. And it would seem then, of course, that it's an act of God, that this is true, that you belong where white people have put you.
Oh my gosh. Yes, so.
It is only since the Second World War
Let's see what they must say.
that there's been a counter image in the world. And that image not come about through any legislation on the part of any American government, but through the fact that Africa was suddenly on the stage of the world, and Africans had to be dealt with in a way that had never been dealt with before. This gave an American Negro for the first time a sense of himself beyond a savage or a clown. It has created and will create a great many conundrums. One of the great things that the white world does not know, but I think I do know, is that black people are just like everybody else. One has used the myth of Negro and the myth of color to pretend and to assume that you are dealing essentially with something exotic, bizarre, and practically, according to human laws, unknown. Alas, that is not true. We are also mercenaries, dictators, murderers, liars. We are human too. What is crucial here is that unless we can manage to establish some kind of dialogue between those people whom I pretend have paid for the American dream and those other people who have not achieved it, we will be in terrible trouble. I want to say at the end, at the last, is that is what concerns me most. We are sitting in this room and we are all, at least we like to think we are, relatively civilized, and we can talk to each other at least on certain levels, so that we could walk out of here assuming that the measure of our enlightenment, or at least our politeness, has some effect on the world. It may not. I remember, for example, when the ex-Attorney General, Mr. Robert Kennedy, said that it was conceivable that in 40 years in America we might have a Negro president. And that sounded like a very emancipated statement, I suppose, to white people. They were not in Harlem when this statement was first heard, and did not hear, and possibly will never hear, the laughter and the bitterness and the scorn with which the statement was greeted. From the point of view of the man in the Harlem barbershop, Bobby Kennedy only got here yesterday. And now he's already on his way to the presidency. We've been here for 400 years, and now he tells us that maybe in 40 years, if you're good, we may let you become president. What is dangerous here is the turning away from anything any white American says. The reason for the political hesitation in spite of the Johnson landslide is the one that's been betrayed by American politicians for so long. And I'm a grown man, and perhaps I can be reasoned with. I certainly hope I can be. But I don't know, and neither does Martin Luther King, none of us know how to deal with those other people whom the white world has so long ignored, who don't believe anything the white world says and don't entirely believe anything I or Martin say. And one can't blame them. You watch what has happened to them in less than 20 years. It seems to me that the city of New York, for example, this is my last point, which has had Negroes in it for a very long time. If the city of New York were able, as it has indeed been able, in the last 15 years to reconstruct itself, tear down buildings and raise great new ones, downtown and for money, and has done nothing whatever except build housing projects in the ghetto for the Negroes. And of course the Negroes hate it. Presently the property does indeed deteriorate because the children cannot bear it. They want to get out of the ghetto. If the American pretensions were based on more solid, a more honest assessment of life and of themselves, it would not mean for Negroes, when someone says urban renewal, that Negroes simply are going to be thrown out into the streets, which is what it does mean now. This is not an act of God. We're dealing with a society made and ruled by men. If the American Negro had not been present in America, I am convinced that the history of the American labor movement would be much more edifying than it is. It is a terrible thing for an entire people to surrender to the notion that 1/9 of its population is beneath them. And until that moment, until the moment comes when we, the American people, are able to accept the fact that I have to accept, for example, that my ancestors are both white and black, that on that continent we are trying to forge a new identity for which we need each other, and that I am not a ward of America. I am not an object of missionary charity. I am one of the people who built the country. Until this moment, there is scarcely any hope for the American dream, because the people who are denied participation in it, by their very presence, will wreck it. And if that happens, it's a very grave moment for the West. Thank you.
It's a land of foam, yeah. It's the land where I come from. Africa, our father's land, is calling us home. So long we've been a slave and no more will we roam, yeah. So I hope and I pray that the day will come when we will see the rising sun. Yeah, now, no more crying, no victimizing, no more starvation, no more killing. Africa is a land of fun, yeah. Africa is a land where all Africans come from. Oftentimes I sit right down and remember those chains. How my people was in slavery time and time again, yeah. But I know that one day when the right time comes, so easily, then we will see right now. No more crying, no victimizing, no more starvation, no more, yeah. Oh, no more killing. Peace and love and unity is what we say in this your time, yeah. Whoa, whoa. Ooh, Africa, our father's land is calling us home. So long we've been a slave and no more will we roam, yeah. But I hope and I pray that the day will come when we will see the rising sun. Yeah, now, oftentimes I sit right down and remember those chains. How my people was in slavery time and time again. But I hope that one day when the right time comes, so easily, then you will see no more killing. Africa is the land of my home, yeah. It's a land where I and I come from. Africa, our father's land is calling us home. So long we've been a slave and no more will we roam no more.
The Civil Rights Act of 1968, just 7 days after the death of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. Well, since then, there have not been any real advances for civil rights in this country. Now, each act that was signed into law gave us the ability to be equal, but not necessarily the ability to be equitable. Equity is the idea and the concept of fairness and justice being distributed amongst all communities to ensure that everyone, regardless of any personal characteristic may have the same access to opportunities and resources. Have you ever thought whether the United States actually reached that level of equality that Dr. King and so many others fought for? Did you simply believe we did just because someone said so? Or did you just not care if we did or didn't? Well, truthfully, yes, we did. Yeah, we reached that level of equality, but the fight was never solely for equality, but much rather equality and that of equity. Now, again, equity is the idea that everyone, regardless of any community you come from, have access to the same amount of opportunities and resources. Many battles were fought to ensure a more perfect and equal union for us all. Battles like that of Bloody Sunday, where 600 peaceful protesters embarked on a 54-mile journey across the Edmund Pettus Bridge from Selma to Montgomery in protest of a 26-year-old black man being killed by a state trooper. Or battles like that at the time of Dr. King's death when he was in Memphis, Tennessee, working with the Poor People's Campaign to ensure that black sanitation and other workers had access to fair wages, fair jobs, fair opportunities, and fair schools for their kids in black communities. Well, a lack of equity is when 18% of black home buyers are denied home loans at double the denial rate of the overall population. To put that in perspective, I'll share a story of a black family out of Baltimore, Maryland, who in 2022 wanted to sell their home. So upon wanting to sell their home, this family decided to invest $70,000 in upgrades. Well, when it came time for them to have their home appraised, this black family received an appraisal value of $472,000. Well, they knew they put much more money into the home and should have received a higher appraisal than that. So what they did is a term that we call whitewash their home. Well, they removed every picture of them as a black family, removed anything of them as a black family, and brought in pictures of a white family, and actually brought a white family to stage the home for them in hopes of receiving a higher appraisal value. Well, to the dismay of this black family, the white family, in fact, did receive a higher appraisal value. They received an appraisal value of $750,000 simply because they were white. Many black people in America have faced disparities in our ability to purchase homes and have faced systemic oppression in systems like through redlining and the systems of oppression through our banking and real estate industries. Now, there have been some advances as far as home ownership for black people in this country, but yet, due to things like high interest rates and credit scores, black people have still yet to receive the equity in being able to obtain and own homes. Lack of equity is when 90% of black college students have to take out student loans versus 66% of our white counterparts, although black Americans only represent 13% of the country's population. Former President Barack Obama paid off his student loans just 4 years before he became president of the United States. Yes, one of the most well-respected black figures in the entire world, regardless of what aisle you sit on the political spectrum, we can all agree that he's a black leader that we all know as a black leader. Well, he paid off his student loans 4 years before he became president. In fact, he's the only president in the United States to deal with student loan in this country. The student loan gap between white and black Americans is significant. According to the Federal Reserve, black Americans held more than double the amount of student loan debt than white and Asian Americans in 2019. Right now, in this country, the average median student loan debt for black households on average is $25,649. Well, let's take that number and we compare it to that of white families in this country, and you receive $11,987, the amount of student loan debt that white families in this country have on average. Right now, black Americans hold more than double the amount of student loan debt, but also are twice as likely to default on our student loans than white Americans are in this country. And many factors, including high interest rates, is to blame in the equity in black college students receiving loans in this country. Lack of equity is when the mean income for white families in America is $980,550 versus that of black families in this country is $142,330. Disparities in our racial and wealth gap in America date back to slavery. In fact, just last year, black Americans had a record spending power of $1.6 trillion. But as I said, only represent 13% of the country's population. Now I'll share a story of former President Abraham Lincoln. Amongst signing the Emancipation Proclamation, President Lincoln sent his Secretary of War, General Edwin M. Stanton, to Savannah, Georgia. When General Stanton got to Savannah, Georgia, he asked a group of black pastors, he said, well, in your new profound freedom, what is it that you all want? One pastor in particular stood up, Pastor Garrison Fraser stood up and said, well, we want land. We want land, and we want it in areas where white Confederates will not be able to come and take it away from us. And it was so. Every black family was issued an order to be given 40 acres of land and a government-provided mule. Hence the story you may have heard before of 40 acres and a mule. Well, unfortunately, President Lincoln was then assassinated, and upon his assassination, President Andrew Johnson stepped in, and he worked to quickly reverse that order. Order 15, the very order that essentially had given Black families land and wealth in this country, had been taken away by the stroke of a pen by the former president. Those disparities in our criminal justice system today, through the racial wealth gap, is the reason that so many Black families continue to suffer in the racial wealth gap today.
People think learning piano takes a really long time, but that's false. Here's
1963, when my grandmother was jailed with Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., when he wrote his infamous letter from the Birmingham jail. During those times, Birmingham Police Commissioner Eugene Bullconnor stuck dogs and hoses on peaceful protesters, including my grandmother. Well, during those days, throughout history, and even through present day, Black people have faced discrimination and racism and mistreatment in our criminal justice system, from unequal levels of force, unjustified stops and searches, and false prosecutions based upon trumped up charges. Well, in this country today, Black Americans make up total 25% of the total population in our US prisons. Although, as I've said before, we only make up 13% of this country's total population. During the Reagan, Nixon, and Clinton administrations, the war on drugs became so big that it's one of the leading causes as to why Black families still face disparities in our criminal justice system. I remember November of 2015. I was 22 years old at the time, and my friends and I were eager to attend a Donald Trump rally in Birmingham, Alabama. We simply wanted our voices to be heard because we couldn't believe someone could spew so much hatred and racism among Black communities, Muslim communities, and other communities of color. So we got inside that day, and one thing that we didn't realize until we got in was that they were serving alcohol that day. Well, we began our chants, Trump sucks, Trump sucks, Trump sucks. Well, then eventually we caught the attention of Donald Trump himself, and when we caught his attention, he looked over at us in the crowd and he told his obnoxious supporters to get them the hell out of here. And that's kind of exactly what they did. They took things into their own hands. Next thing I know, my friends and I, began being surrounded by his supporters, kind of mob style. We were all separated at this point. We're on the ground, we're being kicked and punched and called things like monkey and being told to go get a job. Although this rally was on a Saturday and I was off from my 9-to-5 Monday through Friday job just like they were. But that's not what they saw in me. Oh, but it gets worse. I proceeded to do a CNN interview with former CNN anchor Brooke Baldwin about our experience because one of my friends ended up with a mild concussion that day. And after completion of the interview with Brooke Baldwin, I remember distinctively receiving a Facebook message from a guy in Florida. And his message to me was very clear. He said, "I will make your nigger lips explode." And that was my first true experience and run-in with racism in this country in that way. But these are typically the reactions that one may have when we simply don't understand the concept of racism and privilege in America. Racism is simply one race believing that they hold more wealth, more power, more superiority over another race. And in America, it may be somewhat true. White Americans hold more, in most parts, hold more wealth, better jobs, higher education than most Black Americans. Well, privilege is just that. For the most part, most Black Americans don't enjoy the privilege of walking into a bank and walking out with a home loan. For the most part, most Black Americans don't enjoy the privilege of having credit scores in the 700s or higher. For the most part, most Black Americans don't enjoy the privilege of going to a Starbucks every morning on our commutes to work. Most Black Americans, for the most part, don't enjoy the privilege of being able to travel the entire world. Matter of fact, many Black Americans have never even left their own neighborhoods. But this is what we deal with in America. Every day, white Americans wake up in communities away from crime and in areas where there is usually a Starbucks or a Target. Well, Black Americans, for the most part, wake up in communities where there's gun violence or there's a Dollar General and Family Dollar on every corner and predatory lending. Now, before you believe that Black people are lazy or don't want to do anything or simply don't want to work, just remember that it was Black slaves and Black Americans that built the foundation of this country and have yet to receive any of the benefits other than the things that we see on the surface. From slavery to modern day redlining, racism continues to fuel the very air that we breathe. Now I want you to recognize the privilege that you may have or someone next to you may have. And then once you realize these things, let's understand and work toward a better and more equitable world for us all. And then ask yourself, well, what can we do? How can we all work together to ensure a more equitable world for everyone? And once you realize these things, you think about it, I have a few things that I think could help all of us on our quest for equity. Number one, I believe we can increase diversity in the hiring process. Work to promote an inclusive and diverse workplace and actively work to recruit and hire Black and brown people. Number two, make sure that everyone is paid equitably for the same work. I mentioned before that many Black and brown people in this country have worked tirelessly to work in this country and have yet to receive any kind of equity. But I promise if we work to ensure that everyone is simply paid for the same amount of work, that's one way we can reach the equity gap in this country. Number three, make sure that everyone has equitable access to the same opportunities for professional development, such as mentorship programs and trainings. Number four, let's provide support to underrepresented Black and brown communities in major fields and industries through programs such as scholarships and fellowships. Black and brown kids deserve to imagine being on Harvard's campus, even if they have no money. And lastly, let's offer flexibility within work and other opportunities. I implore to offer part-time work, offer seasonal work. A lot of families of color work 3-4 jobs to be able to provide for their families, and it shouldn't be that way. But if we offer flexibility, we will allow people to spend more time with their families and reach equity that way. In conclusion, equity is the foundation of a better country and world for communities of color all around. I want us to pause and reflect on the possibilities of where we could be if we did this thing together. And then I want you to think, just think what role can you play in ensuring a more equitable world for everyone. Just because some of you may have went to college for free doesn't mean everyone can afford to. Just because some of you may have high-paying jobs doesn't mean everyone has the skill set to. And just because you may have been left a trust fund or some other kind of wealth policy doesn't mean everyone has access to wealth. But if we come together and we put our minds together and put our hearts together, I believe we can all reach that level of equity and a better world that we hope for.
Well, yeah. It's all about a dream. Now, have you ever had a dream? Yes. where you wanna wake up cause you think you're in a jam. Then listen this. Felt a little tired, I decided to call it a night. I never stood you up before, you know I wouldn't do. Talk to myself that tomorrow it's gonna be alright. After work the evening's gonna be for me and you. But honey, felt a little cold, so I tucked myself in. And before you know it, I was sleeping like a baby. I had the craziest dream. I was caught red-handed in a love game. What do I do and how do I explain when all her tears come falling down her face, down her face, yeah, down her face, yes, yes. All them tears come falling down her face, down her face, yeah, down her face. Hey, hey. She stood there cold as ice. That scene was not so nice. Looked right through me as if I wasn't there. Yeah, was as if in a spell. So confused I could tell. Couldn't believe she's the one standing there. Yeah, yeah. It was then that I woke up, happy to know we never broke up. And I'm gonna see you tomorrow again. But trust me, the sweat that I burst could quench everybody's thirst. It's good to know nobody's in pain. Yeah, yeah. All her tears come falling down her face, down her face, yeah, down her face, yes, yes. All them tears come falling down her face, down her face, yeah, down her face. Oh, oh, oh. Oh, what a crazy dream I had. Yeah. Have you ever had one of them dreams, babe? Yeah. Gosh, I remember all her tears come falling down her face. Yeah.
Oh, welcome to the BFSG, the Black Father Support Group show. I'm just playing some clips here because, you know, there's a time when you just need to just review some things, you know, what's gone past in your life, yeah?
Someone wrote you a letter. What's going on?
I can't believe it's you, man.
Good to see you.
Man, you know, I never told you, man, but you know that money, it helped me to get my surgery next week. I got problems with my hips, man. I didn't have enough to get that surgery.
Do you have my note?
I gave it to a friend that needed the same kind of inspiration.
Do you remember what my note says?
Of course I do. Life is hard, but harder when you give up.
Oh, man.
The next time you see me, I'll be walking better. It's because of you. Thank you so much, man. I appreciate it.
You're very welcome.
I love you, brother.
I love you too.
What you did for me, man. If it wasn't for you, man, I wouldn't be getting my surgery.
Hey, sir. Someone wrote you a letter.
We come to dig up corruption, dig up and kill it from the root. Kill it, teach the youth the truth, teach the youth burn the wrath of God. Hey, too much illusion, confusion in their material world. Too much corruption and destruction in their material world. They have too much illusion, confusion in the material world.
Are you close?
Too much corruption and destruction in the material world. So no for them I try to be down. But we purge them with word power and a sound. We spread the righteousness all around, so that the youths can stand the ground. Say just said I am not to walk. Manuel Jah works must perform. The things say them can run warm. Rasta is a raging storm. They have too much illusion, confusion in the material world. They have too much corruption and destruction in the material world.
Are you cool?
They have too much illusion, confusion in the material world. Too much corruption and destruction in the material world. Marcos and Fuga, wash your foot and
hand on the wall.
the water.
Put your
The
hand
works
down.
that you've done for Mama Africa. Some man come down here, come bad for Gaza, and a bad for Gully and bring down disaster. The Gaza comes and the Gully come down because their foundation was not solid. Just root them out, root them out, them and them freaky man. Them and them filthy man. Brother them, none of them I want them, but them don't want the air. None of them have majority of the people in fair. They look like some of them broken for the Japan and bear. But if them distill like and them bound to get there. Jamaican, Jackabala and shout it out clear. Emmanuel, they are so hidden deep. Way too much illusion, confusion in their material world. They have too much corruption and destruction in the material world. Too much illusion, confusion in the material world. Too much corruption, destruction in the material world. Oh, better. I come here to dig up corruption and kill it from the root. We come to dig up corruption and kill it from the root. I'm a gonna so few root up corruption. Root it out, don't leave a fruit. We come to dig up corruption and burn them out. 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 Dig up corruption. Burn them out. Dig them out. Burn them out.
Growing up was tough. I was bullied a lot. I was smart, but I was bullied like an average girl. I didn't want to go to school. I just couldn't concentrate, couldn't focus. I was terrified. That's how I learned how to run fast, is by running from my bullies. I was running so much that I even had considered committing suicide to avoid getting beat up more and more and more. And my grandmother said, God blessed you with that athletic frame. They don't understand it. But as long as you use the gift that God gave you, that body, you're going to go out there and you're going to whoop some ass. Little brown poor girl who was bullied a lot, who thought even about committing suicide, was terrified, moved school to school, school to school, school to school, ran from everyone. How did she become the most dangerous woman in the world?
Where are we, black men? Where are we? That a sister would want to do that to herself, huh? Why?
I grew up in Chester, Pennsylvania.
Just listen,
suburban
couple
area
minutes,
outside
couple
Philadelphia,
minutes.
And didn't even know I was poor until I went to college and went on out in the world and realized that, wow, we were really poor, but we were happily poor. My school experience in Chester was tough because I was bullied a lot. And my uncle, he was a martial art instructor. He said, listen, you can't continue to run all your life, Regan. He said, now this is what we're going to do. I want to introduce you to karate. I said, I want to fight. He said, it's not about fighting. What we're going to do is rebuild your self-confidence. Every Saturday, I would spar with my uncle for 1 hour. He would walk in, lock the door, and put the key down behind him. The goal was for me to get the key, unlock it, and walk out. But I had to get past him. He went tough on me just like a man would. And I would always find myself getting closer to the key, and then he'd move me back. I found myself getting closer and closer to the door. He'd move me back. Then finally, I'll never forget the day I fought my way past, got the key, unlocked the door, and walked out. That's how I earned my black belt. Then they started entering me in tournaments, and I started winning them left and right, getting first place, getting second place. A few times I got disqualified, but I just wanted more and more and more because I found a new love. Not only were my skills getting sharper and growing and improving, but I also realized that my confidence was starting to develop and grow and get stronger, as well as my self-esteem. And once those were all together, the rest was history. I'm in this combat training center, training with some of the best world champions on the planet, and I have the opportunity to be a part of their team. I was on cloud nine. I was like a sponge. I wanted to learn everything. Then they started getting me fights, one by one, getting me fights, and I was winning. And then the next thing I know, it was probably about 2:30, 3 a.m. in the morning. I'm tired, I'm done, I'm ready to go. And this gentleman was there. So dude was like, look, I'll take you home. So we're driving on down. I tell him, I'll make it right here in Coliseum. Suddenly he makes a left turn. And I'm like, this is not where I live. I live this way. He was like, look here, why don't you just give me a little, let me just stick it in. I said, no, man, I don't want you sticking it in. And I tried to bust out the door, but I couldn't because there was no knob. And I ran to the back of the van to try to run out the back of the van. There was this big chain on it and a lock. I couldn't get out. When he tried to tackle me, I grabbed the end of his shirt tail and I pulled it over him real fast, tied it, and I swung him back. And I pulled his pants down over his shoes. Then I stepped on his chest and I said, where the keys at, motherfucker? He said, they're in my pocket. I reached in, I grabbed the keys, I pulled the chain off. I said, let me tell you something, man. When a bitch says no, she means no. And I hit him. Wait! And I ran. 15 years later, here I am, retired, coming in from the gym, turn the TV on, and they got him right there.
Major break in the search for a serial killer. LA police do have a suspect now in the Grim Sleeper case.
They arrested the man early this morning, identified as Lonnie David Franklin Jr.
I picked the phone up real fast. I called my mother. I called my grandmother. I was like, you know that guy that tried to rape me in the van about 15 years ago? He's a serial killer. He had raped and killed over 100 black women in Inglewood and killed them in his car and his van. And to this day, I have PTSD as a result of that van experience. But what I didn't know then is that that fight in the van was just a warm-up for what was to come.
Until next time, we're coming for you, the Black Father Support Group Show, here on the Galaxy of we.net. No mercy.
Only Jah can save us now. Yes. Only Jah can save us now. I see them rising up in war machine. Warmongers cooking up another scheme to wipe the human population clean. But wicked men cannot fulfill their dreams. History is trying to repeat itself. Yes. You can read it in their books, on their shelves.